December 7th, 1941, Cambridge, Massachusetts. Maria Telkes sits in her laboratory at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, listening to the radio announcement that Japanese aircraft have attacked Pearl Harbor. And she knows with absolute certainty that within weeks, the Pacific Ocean will become a graveyard for American sailors and airmen who will survive torpedoes and crashes only to die of thirst while floating on life rafts surrounded by undrinkable seawater. The problem is not new. Shipwreck survivors have faced dehydration for as long as humans have sailed, and the solution is theoretically simple. Remove the salt from seawater through distillation, boiling it to vapor, and condensing the steam back to pure water. But conventional distillation requires fuel, equipment, and stable platforms that sinking ships and downed aircraft cannot provide. And the emergency water supplies carried on life rafts, typically a few gallons in sealed tins, run out within days, leaving survivors to choose between drinking salt water, which accelerates dehydration and leads to kidney failure, or drinking nothing and dying of thirst within a week. Telkes, a 41-year-old Hungarian-born physical chemist who has spent the past 2 years studying solar energy conversion at MIT, understands that the ocean itself can provide the energy needed for distillation if someone can design a device simple enough to operate on a life raft, robust enough to survive weeks at sea, and cheap enough to manufacture in quantities sufficient to equip thousands of vessels. She has 6 months to build it, because the Office of Scientific Research and Development has just asked her to solve a problem that will kill hundreds of American servicemen if she fails. The crisis Telkes faced was both immediate and statistical, a problem of physics compounded by the brutal arithmetic of naval warfare in the Pacific. When ships sank, and in 1942, American ships were sinking at an alarming rate as German U-boats operated along the Atlantic coast and Japanese submarines hunted in the Pacific. Survivors who made it to life rafts faced a cascade of threats: exposure to sun and cold, starvation, shark attacks, and most urgently, dehydration. The human body requires approximately 2 quarts of water per day to maintain basic function in temperate conditions, and in the tropics, where the sun beats down and salt spray coats everything, that requirement doubles. Standard life raft emergency kits in 1941 carried 3 to 5 gallons of water in sealed tins, enough for one person for perhaps 10 days if rationed carefully, but most rafts carried multiple survivors, and the water supply divided among them lasted only 3 or 4 days. After that, men died. The Navy's survival manuals warned explicitly against drinking seawater, explaining that the salt content would draw water out of body tissues through osmosis, accelerating rather than relieving dehydration. But desperate men ignored the warnings and drank anyway, hastening their deaths. Anecdotal reports from early war rescues described survivors found dead on rafts with emergency water supplies still sealed, either because they had not understood how to open the containers or because they had been too weakened by dehydration to manage the simple task of puncturing a tin. The technical challenge of solar distillation was conceptually straightforward, but practically difficult. Distillation works by heating water until it vaporizes. leaving dissolved salts and other impurities behind, then cooling the vapor so it condenses back into pure liquid water. On land, with access to fuel and equipment, distillation is routine. It is how fresh water is produced in arid regions and on ships that carry desalination plants. But on a life raft adrift in the open ocean, fuel is unavailable, equipment must be minimal, and the only energy source is sunlight. Solar distillation had been demonstrated experimentally in the 19th century, with large installations using glass-covered evaporation pans to produce fresh water in desert regions. But those systems were massive, immobile, and required careful maintenance. What Telkes needed to design was a device small enough to fit on a standard 8-foot by 4-foot life raft, light enough not to burden survivors trying to deploy it, simple enough that an exhausted, frightened sailor could operate it without training, durable enough to withstand salt spray and rough handling, and efficient enough to produce at least 1 quart of fresh water per day, the minimum needed to keep one person alive. And it had to cost almost nothing to manufacture, because the Navy would need thousands of them. Telkes brought to the problem a background that was unusual for a woman in 1941 and ideal for the task at hand. Born in Budapest in 1900, she had studied physical chemistry at the University of Budapest, earning a bachelor's degree in 1920 and a doctorate in 1921-1924, at a time when women represented less than 15% of university students in Hungary. She emigrated to the United States in 1925, worked for 12 years as a biophysicist at the Cleveland Clinic Foundation studying energy transformations in living organisms, then moved to Westinghouse Electric in 1937 to develop thermocouples that converted heat directly into electricity. Her interest in solar energy, sparked by a book she had read in high school about alternative energy sources, led her to MIT in 1939, when she learned that the university had established a solar energy conversion project. She wrote to the project director, Professor Hoyt Hautel, asking for a position, and when she was not immediately hired, she traveled to Cambridge and demonstrated a thermoelectric prototype she had built that was 10 times more efficient at converting sunlight to electricity than existing devices. Hautel hired her in July 1939, and she spent the next 2 years working on solar-powered thermoelectric generators, learning the fundamentals of heat transfer, radiation absorption, and thermal efficiency that would prove essential when the war redirected her work toward survival equipment. The device Telkes designed in early 1942 exploited the greenhouse effect that occurs when sunlight passes through a transparent cover and heats a dark surface beneath it. Her solar still consisted of a collapsible frame made of thin metal rods that supported 2 layers of transparent plastic film separated by an air gap. The bottom layer was painted black to absorb solar radiation, and beneath it sat a shallow pan containing seawater. When sunlight passed through the transparent layers and struck the black surface, it heated the water in the pan, causing it to evaporate. The water vapor rose and contacted the cooler upper layer of plastic film, where it condensed into droplets of pure water. The salt and other impurities remained in the pan below. The condensed water ran down the sloped film into a collection gutter that drained into a storage container. The entire device could be deflated and folded into a package small enough to fit inside a life raft's emergency kit, weighed less than 3 pounds, and required no assembly beyond unfolding the frame and filling the evaporation pan with seawater. The plastic film was a new material called mylar, a polyester resin that was transparent, weatherable, and far more durable than the celluloid films that previous experimental solar stills had used. Telkes calculated that, under tropical sun conditions, with good weather, her device could evaporate and condense approximately 1 quart of fresh water per day, enough to sustain one person indefinitely. The development proceeded with urgency, but also with frustration, because Telkes was not in charge of the project. Hottel was, and his priorities did not always align with operational necessity. She completed a working prototype in 1942 and demonstrated it successfully to Navy observers, who immediately requested mass production. But Hottel focused on minimizing costs and optimizing manufacturing contracts, changed suppliers 3 times over the next 2 years, renegotiating prices and specifications while the war consumed ships and men. Telkes and others on the project, including Godfrey Cabot, a wealthy industrialist who funded much of MIT's solar research, expressed frustration that Hottel's delays were rendering the solar still much less useful than it might have been. The device that could have saved lives in 1942 and 1943 did not enter production until late 1944, and deployment to the fleet occurred primarily in 1945, the final year of the war. Telkes received a Certificate of Merit from the Office of Scientific Research and Development in 1945 for her work, and in 1952, she became the first recipient of the Society of Women Engineers Achievement Award. But the recognition came years after the peak crisis had passed. The impact of Telkes's solar still, while delayed, was nonetheless significant and measurable. Navy records indicate that the device was deployed on life rafts aboard hundreds of ships and aircraft in the final year of the war, and post-war survival accounts credit it with saving the lives of torpedoed sailors and downed airmen who used it to produce drinking water during extended periods adrift. The device was simple enough that survivors could operate it even in weakened condition. Fill the pan with seawater, unfold the frame, position it in sunlight, and wait for condensation to accumulate. 1 quart per day was not luxury, but it was survival, and combined with rainwater collection. When weather permitted, it gave survivors a realistic chance of lasting until rescue arrived. The psychological effect was perhaps as important as the physical benefit. Men who knew they could produce fresh water were less likely to give in to despair, less likely to drink seawater in desperation, and more likely to maintain discipline and rationing of emergency supplies. The solar still gave survivors agency, a way to actively work toward their own survival, rather than passively waiting to die. The post-war applications of Telkes's device extended beyond military use and demonstrated her original vision of solar technology serving civilian populations. After the war, scaled-up versions of her solar still were deployed in the U.S. Virgin Islands, where fresh water was chronically scarce, and conventional desalination plants were prohibitively expensive for the small island economy. The solar distillers produced hundreds of gallons per day, supplementing wells and rainwater cisterns, and providing reliable fresh water to communities that had previously depended on expensive imports. Telkes received a patent for her solar still design in 1968, 26 years after she built the first prototype, and the principles she established, passive solar heating, phase change condensation, minimal moving parts, became foundational for later developments in solar desalination technology that continue to provide fresh water in arid regions today. Modern solar stills used in disaster relief and remote locations still employ variations of Telkes's basic design, using transparent covers, black absorber surfaces, and condensation collection, though they incorporate improved materials and more efficient geometries. The broader story of Maria Telkes's career illustrates both the possibilities and the obstacles facing women in wartime science. She was brilliant, productive, and practical, focused not on theoretical elegance, but on building devices that worked and served real human needs. Yet she operated in an institutional environment that did not fully value her contributions, working under a supervisor who delayed deployment of her most important invention and later agitated for her dismissal from MIT over disagreements about another project. She was fired from MIT in 1953, despite having developed the solar heating system for the Dover Sun House, the first fully solar-heated residence, which operated successfully for 3 winters before material failures, unrelated to her core design, led to criticism. She spent the rest of her career moving between universities and private companies, continuing to develop solar ovens, solar dryers, and thermal storage systems, receiving awards and patents, but never holding the kind of tenured academic position or institutional authority that her accomplishments warranted. The media called her the Sun Queen, a nickname that was both respectful and diminishing, acknowledging her expertise while emphasizing her gender in ways that male scientists never experienced. The legacy of Telkes's solar still rests not on dramatic rescue stories or inflated casualty statistics. The war was vast, and no single piece of equipment saved thousands of lives in isolation, but on the quieter achievement of giving desperate men a tool that worked when they needed it most. A sailor floating on a raft in the Pacific in 1945, his ship sunk, his crewmates dead or scattered, facing days or weeks before rescue might arrive, could unfold a piece of plastic and metal, fill a pan with seawater, and watch as the sun slowly, patiently produced drops of fresh water that accumulated into a quart, then another quart, keeping him alive. That sailor likely never knew the name Maria Telkes, never knew that a Hungarian-born chemist working in a Cambridge laboratory had spent months designing the device he now depended on, never knew that her invention had been delayed for years by bureaucratic obstruction and institutional indifference. He simply used the equipment he had been given, and it worked, and he survived. That is the measure of engineering success. Not recognition, not credit, but function. The numbers, to the extent they can be verified, support the conclusion that solar stills saved lives, though precise attribution is impossible in the chaos of war. Survival rates for sailors and airmen adrift at sea improved in the final year of the war compared to earlier periods, and while multiple factors contributed, better rescue coordination, improved emergency kits, enhanced training, the availability of freshwater production capability was among them. Post-war interviews with survivors frequently mention the solar still as a critical piece of equipment, and Navy training manuals from 1945 onward included detailed instructions for operating it, evidence that the service considered it valuable enough to warrant formal instruction. The device remained in Navy emergency kits for decades after the war, superseded eventually by more advanced desalination technologies, but serving as the foundation for those later developments. Maria Telkes continued working on solar energy applications for nearly 50 more years after the war, driven by a vision she had articulated in 1942 when interviewed by the Christian Science Monitor. "It is the things supposed to be impossible that interest me. I like to do things they say cannot be done." She helped develop Solar One, an experimental solar-powered house at the University of Delaware in the 1970s, and consulted with the Department of Energy on the first solar electric residence built in Carlisle, Massachusetts in 1980. She accumulated more than 20 patents, published over 100 papers, and received numerous awards, including the Charles Greeley Abbott Award from the American Solar Energy Society in 1977, recognizing her as one of the world's foremost solar energy pioneers. She retired as Professor Emeritus from the University of Delaware in 1978, but continued consulting until the early 1990s. In 1995, she returned to Budapest for the first time in 70 years to visit family, and she died there on December 2nd, 10 days before what would have been her 95th birthday. American newspapers did not report her death until months later, evidence that despite her achievements, she remained less widely known than she deserved to be. The solar still Telkes, designed in 1942, sits today in the collections of the Smithsonian Institution and the National Inventors Hall of Fame. A simple device of plastic film and metal frame that saved lives through the elegant application of physics to an urgent human problem. It represents a way of thinking about technology that prioritizes function over complexity, that recognizes that the best solution is often the simplest one that works, and that understands that innovation serves not abstract scientific goals, but concrete human needs. A sailor dying of thirst does not care about the theoretical efficiency of a desalination process. He cares whether the device produces water. Telkes still produced water, and because it did, men lived who would otherwise have died. That is engineering stripped to its essence. Identify the problem, understand the constraints, design the solution, make it work. No glory, no recognition, just competent work, executed under pressure by someone who understood that failure was not an option, because lives depended on success.